Our next part should be considered to be sort of this part, I should say. But if you're not, if this isn't the, I know this is a long form video, but if it isn't the long form video, which is all the bot together, then hi. Here we go, on to the Western DVDs. Only for the pay-per-views. So we've got Survivor Series 2003, which has Goldberg versus Triple H, Undertaker, Mr. McMahon, Shane, Kane, Steam Stone Cold versus Team Eric Bischoff, Team Kurt Angle versus Team Lesnar, Moyo versus Eaton, Basson Brothers versus Eddie and Chavo Guerrero. Los Guerreros, I think they were called. These are in order of when they came out before you when they happened before you asked. I was going to say when they came out. That wouldn't work. Look, bit of a difference from figures, but next we have Royal Rumble 04, the infamous one that Chris Benoit won. I've seen these ones, but I haven't seen some of these out. But Survivor Series 03 isn't that good. But this is the match card for Royal Rumble 04. We have Dudley Boyz versus Ric Flair and Batista. That match is absolutely terrible. Rey Mysterio and Jamie Noble, Eddie and Chavo, the Royal Rumble, Brock Lesnar and Hulk Hogan, and Triple H versus Shawn Michaels. That last man standing match is the only real reason you should be watching it. I can't lie. The Royal Rumble side as well. Next, so I haven't watched, I'll be honest. There's SummerSlam 04 where Undertaker faced JBL and Randy Orton faced Chris Benoit. I knew this was a match that Randy won though. So we had Rey Mysterio, Paul Heyman and Billy Kidman versus Spike Dudley, Bubba Ray and Devon. We had Edge, Batista and Chris Jericho, Booker T and John Cena, Matt Hardy and Kane, Triple H and Eugene. Eugene's pretty an offensive gimmick now, if I say so myself. Eddie Guerrero and Kurt Angle, JBL, Undertaker and Chris Benoit and Randy Orton. Next, another show I haven't watched, if I'm perfectly honest. I haven't watched most of these, I'm only to start. I'm going through them. Backcast 05. On this show, we have the tag title tournament. We had Kane versus Visaria, Benoit and Edge, Shelton Benjamin and Jericho, Shawn Michaels and Hulk Hogan versus Muhammad Hassan and Daivari. I don't know how to say this. And then Batista versus Triple H. Next, another show I haven't watched, but we have the Judgment Day 2005. On this match, we had Paul Heyman versus Chavo Guerrero. I don't know how to say Chris Jericho. I don't even know if he's on this match. So Eminem versus Hardcore High and Charlie Haas. Booker T versus Kurt Angles. Big Show versus Kaito. Leander Jordan versus Hayden Reed. Rey Mysterio and Eddie Guerrero. And the iconic WWE title I Quit match. Eddie Guerrero. Not Eddie Guerrero. Because I just saw Rey versus Eddie. The John Cena versus JBL. I've seen those last two matches, but I'm going to re-rate them when I re-watch the show. Next, WrestleMania 22. Now, I haven't watched the show. I've seen Edge versus, so obviously, if I've seen a match, I'm going to remove the match from my ratings, yes, and then re-rate it when I watch the full show. But on WrestleMania 22, we had Big Show and Kane versus Kaito and Chris Masters, Ric Flair versus RVD versus Shelton Benjamin versus Matt Hardy versus Finney versus Bobby Lashley. That match is something. Chris Benoit and JBL, Mick Foley and Edge, Boogeyman versus Booker T and Sharmell, Trish Stratus versus Mickie James. Undertaker versus Mark Henry. I need to keep... Remember, you're not going to see the pause, stop recording, and take photo thing. And Shawn Michaels versus Mr. McMahon. Kurt Angle's Rey Mysterio, Randy Orton. Tori Wilson, Candice Michelle, and John Cena versus Triple H. Next, I bet you can't guess. Another show I haven't watched. One Night Stand 07. The infamous one where, if I remember right, Mr. McMahon wins the ECW title. In this one, we have Mr. McMahon versus Bobby Lashley. Edge versus Batista. RVD versus Randy Orton. John Cena versus Great Khali. Hardy's versus World's Greatest Tag Team. Kane versus Mark Henry. Mina versus Candice Michelle, and CM Punk, Tommy Dreamer, and Sandman versus Elijah Burke, Marcus Corvon, and Matt Striker. Unforgiven 2007. Specifically on the 2007 part. We'll see why in a minute. But in this show, we have... I haven't seen any of these matches, though. John Cena versus Randy Orton. Great Khali, Rey Mysterio, and Batista. You can tell who was the... hold on out there. No offense to Rey. That's great. Massive guy. And then you have Rey Mysterio. Matt Hardy and MVP versus Deuce and Domino. Matt Hardy and MVP, such a weird team. Triple H and Kaito, which I know I'm not seeing the match times, but no GQ for Kaito. I thought that was interesting. That's why I got in. That's the only reason I got the show. Candice Michelle versus Beth Phoenix. Yance Cade and Trevor Murdoch versus Brian Kendrick and Paul London. CM Punk versus Elijah Burke, and Undertaker versus Mark Henry. Next we had No Way Out 2008. Got it for 50p in a charity shop. And this one, yes, that's right. John Cena versus Randy Orton again. Edge versus Rey Mysterio. Edge wasn't even in that triple threat, but he must have won the title somewhere. Triple H, Jeff Hardy, Shawn Michaels, Chris Jericho, JBL, and Umaga. Ric Flair versus Mr. Kennedy, Batista, Great Khali, Big Daddy V, MVP, Finlay, Undertaker, and then Chavo versus CM Punk. I said this match would have, not this match, this part would be as long, but it might end up being long. This might annoy with some fans, but as a BUA WrestleMania 24, this one has Finlay versus JBL, Jericho versus Benjamin versus Morrison versus Kaito versus CM Punk versus MVP versus Mr. Kennedy. Batista versus Umaga, Chavo Guerrero versus Kane, Ric Flair versus Shawn Michaels. Also, iconic match there. Maria and Ashley versus Beth Phoenix and Melina. Randy Orton versus Triple H versus John Cena, because of course Randy Orton and John Cena are in the same match again. Nothing can be worse than the Randy John Cena match that they had last year. Big Show versus Floyd Mayweather, and then Edge versus Undertaker. Next we have Unforgiven at 2008, where we have here Mark Henry versus Matt Hardy versus Finlay versus Miz versus Chavo Guerrero. I've seen only that match of it. Cody Rhodes versus... No, not Cody Rhodes versus... Cody Rhodes and Ted DiBiase versus Crime Time. Shawn Michaels versus Chris Jericho. Triple H versus Jeff Hardy versus MVP versus Shelton Benjamin versus Brian Kendrick. Michelle McCool versus Maurice, and then Batista versus Rey Mysterio versus Kane versus JBL versus Chris Jericho. Which kind of, it's saying that kind of spoils the thing of Chris Jericho replacing. And now we have another Backlash 2009. We had John Cena versus Edge, Jack Clark versus Christian, Jeff Hardy versus Matt Hardy. I didn't even know this one. You can guess which match I got it for. Triple H, Batista and Shane McMahon versus Randy Orton, Cody Rhodes and Ted DiBiase. Rick Healer Dragon Steamboat versus Chris Jericho, the match I got it for because that happened. CM Punk versus Kane. Great Khali. Oh, that's not a match. Okay, fair enough. Next, we have another 2009 show. Sounds weird, it didn't turn out anything in there, but there is. Survivor Series 2009. Where we have John Cena versus Shawn Michaels versus Triple H, and he forgot about Triple H. Undertaker versus Big Show versus Chris Jericho. Kofi Kingston, MVP, Mark Henry, Christian and R-Truth, what a team. Versus Randy Orton, Cody Rhodes. That's ironic after SmackDown. Ted DiBiase, CM Punk and William Regal. Then another one where we had John Morrison, Matt Hardy, Finney, Evan Bourne, and Shelton Benjamin versus The Miz, Drew McIntyre, Jack Swagger, Sheamus, and Dolph Ziggler. Then Mickey James, Mina, KK, Gail Kim, and Eve Torres versus Michelle McCool, Beth Phoenix, Cesar Fox, Yaya, and Jay and Hall, and then Rey Mysterio versus Batista. Next we have Extreme Rules 2010. Where we have here John Cena versus Batista, Randy Orton versus Jack Swagger, Rey Mysterio versus CM Punk, Triple H versus Sheamus, Edge versus Chris Jericho, Big Show versus Big Show and The Miz versus R-Truth and John Morrison. Two random teams versus MVP and Mark Henry versus the Hart Dynasty. Only one of those sounds like it makes sense, but then it couldn't be Bret Hart and Owen Hart. That Big Show and The Miz, that's a weird team. R-Truth and John Morrison, weird team. MVP and Mark Henry, weird team. And yes, there's something I forgot about. Beth Phoenix versus Michelle McCool and JTG versus Sad. SATD, Sad. Now, WrestleMania, now if I'm remembering correctly, not a single title changes hands. Wow, there's only 2 titles on the line as well. WrestleMania 2027. On this we had Undertaker versus Triple H. Edge versus Alberto Del Rio. Yay, because we love Alberto Del Rio. We hate him, okay. Randy Orton versus CM Punk. Twist Status. Nicole and John Morrison versus Yay Cool and Dolph Ziggler. Fair enough. Miz versus John Cena. Jerry Lawler versus Michael Cole. God, that match is, if that match is the match I'm thinking it is. That's pretty funny. Rey Mysterio versus Cody Rhodes. Big Show, Kane and Kofi Kingston and Santino Marella versus The Coreway. Or Jackie Jackson. Next we have SummerSlam 2011. Where we have John Cena versus CM Punk. Christian versus Randy Orton. Sheamus versus Mark Henry, Rey Mysterio, John Morrison and Kofi Kingston versus Miz, R-Truth and Alberto Del Rio. Teams on these shows just get random. Daniel Bryan versus Wade Barrett. Battle for what now is the commentators. And KK versus Beth Phoenix. Elimination Chamber 2019. Oh, we get this. I'm not going to bother reading all that out. You can have it until it goes 15 minutes. And 10 seconds. And 5 seconds. There you go, if you don't read it, you should have paused it. And we also have Royal Rumble 2021. I hate the new way they do the max. I'm sorry, I just do. Next, that's the end of the WWE ones. But one that people might not know as much, but might also know as much. 1PW. Know Your Enemy, Night 1. Spoilers, but we also have Night 2. But Night 1 includes Pac versus Dragon Uso versus Stevie Yen. Iceman versus Kevin Steen, better known as Kevin Owens. Starring James Keenan versus Spud, starring James Nealon, better known as Corey Graves. Johnny Storm and Jody, whoever that is, versus Austin Aries and Roderick Strong. Southern Comfort versus Al Snow and Nabu Meany. Team SAG versus Ricky and Chad. AJ Styles and Christopher Daniels versus Jant Storm and Andy. I'm calling him Andy. Muhammad and Takeshi versus Doug Williams and Nigel McGuinness. Steve Corino versus Chris Cage and Abyss versus Ulf. That's what we're getting. And then Night 2, we had Ulf and Iceman confrontation. Nigel versus Jay Phoenix. Chad versus Wiki. Pac versus El Ligero, yay. Versus Spud versus Stevie Ian versus Dragon Age versus Darkseid. Chris Hamwick versus SJK. Al Snow and Nabu Meany versus Muhammad and Takahashi versus Austin Aries and Roderick Strong. Johnny Storm and Jody Fletcher versus Southern Comfort. AJ Styles and Christopher Daniels versus Team SAG. Jant Storm versus Doug Williams. AJ Styles and Christopher Daniels versus Johnny Storm and Jody, because you know you don't want to watch those and not know who goes through. And then Abyss versus Christian Cage versus Steve Corino. And our final one is another 1PW. That is a pretty cool edge I'm in with barbed wire hair. Abyss. Now it's invincible. Invincible. And on this side, there's a bonus match of the Damnation versus the Chavs. Fair enough. Jimmy Wave versus Onigara, yay. Well done, Saxon, bro. Martin Stone versus Iceman. Andy versus Martin Stone. We don't want to know that. You might want to know that it's an open change, so you shouldn't put who enters the change. Austin Aries, Roderick Strong, and Matt versus Darkseid and the Briscoes. I didn't actually know what was on this, so other than Steve and the Abyss. So this show looks really good. We only got this today. Same with Judgment Day. Unforgiven 07. Backcast 09. Bryan Danielson versus Samoa Joe versus Jay Phoenix. Doug Williams versus Nigel McGuinness. Johnny Storm and Jody versus Team SAG. I'm assuming they might have won that thing. And then the survival of the sickest, the elimination tag match. It does say tag, but I want to. Steve Corino, Southern Comfort, Teddy Hart and Spud versus Abyss, SJK, Matt and Team Supreme. Well, that's the end of the Washing one. Again, on to the next one, or thanks for watching. And please check out the other parts if this isn't on to the next one.